Welcome back to the Acceptable Chess Weekly Roundup, where we take some time to celebrate our successes, lament our mistakes, and learn how to do it better next week. I am here as your host, John Harden, once again with my friend and national master, Andrew Hoy, and we are looking at the results of Round 5. Andrew, where do things stand?
Yeah, so it looks like we have a clear leader for the first time in the tournament. Alex Host won his game against Rufus, and that was a really back-and-forth game, an exciting game that we're going to look at later tonight. And I think that with that win, he has secured at least a share of first place.
Yes.
Although it looks like he will be playing Felix, who is a ever-dangerous opponent. So really anything could still happen in the last round.
Yeah, and I do know from some conversations with Felix that he is determined to play spoiler and see if he can get into a slice of this winner's pie.
Excellent.
So I'm excited to see that game. I'm sure that Felix will bring his A effort. But fabulous. As far as topics and trends this week, I'm going to take the lead off on this one. I wanted to break things down and do something a little bit simpler. And I wanted to talk about a very simple idea, which is simply removing the guard. So this is, when we talk about simple tactics, we often talk about them on the show in a general way. I wanted to talk just about this simple idea of, just to take an example here, let's go ahead and roll through a sample position from the Ruy Lopez. Right, this idea of, for example, playing bishop b5 to pressure the knight because the knight is defending the pawn. Now, those of you who play the Ruy Lopez will realize this is not a real threat. Yes. But this tactical idea is one that I find that our players are regularly missing, and I'm going to take at least two opportunities to note when it occurred. Once in which it was missed, and once in which it was played with very powerful effect. So that is just something I wanted to draw our players' attention to. Now, Andrew.
Excellent.
You wanted to talk about attack and defense.
Yeah, so very large topic, more than we can cover in one quick recap. But there are a couple of things that we wanted to point out. Generally, when attacking, you want to open up the enemy king. And when you're defending against an attack, I think we'll see a few examples of this later. It can be very helpful to open up the center so that your pieces can get more mobility. And one of the most important things is maintaining your own pawn structure in front of the king so that there aren't as many attacking ideas.
Yeah.
And we'll see that as it comes up, but just bear that in mind that that is something that's important to chess. The number one thing has to be king safety in any chess game.
Yeah, I have to say that from looking at the games, I saw very much a theme of sometimes winning positions in which the player just had to hang on and find some defensive ideas, and they weren't able to do it. So the defense side of that, to me, gets the heavier emphasis, but I think you're quite right. And then the last one is definitely going to get its feature because of where it most clearly came up this week, but to remain objective, or we also talk about maintain objectivity. So for me, I find that this most comes up when I'm playing a lower-rated player. If I'm ever in a situation in which I feel that I am expected to win in a particular situation, I find it sometimes difficult to switch my thinking from, okay, I have to beat this person, into maybe a situation in which a draw is the best that I can possibly do, or I just have to claw my way away from losing, even. And these are kind of very important mental transitions that are important that you don't see talked about in a lot of chess books. Yeah. But, Andrew, I know you wanted to talk about a situation that wasn't just about playing lower-rated players.
Yeah, well, first of all, I agree with everything you just said, and this is certainly a do as we say, not as we do. I am the worst person when it comes to objectivity. I have played...
Oh, sorry, you're just the worst person.
Yeah, well, that too. But I have played so many games, and I've had a really nice position, but it's not really winning. It's mostly equal, and then I overpress and lose, and it just has become a thing. And you press too hard and you lose, and it turns out that playing for a win turns out to be playing for a loss. And I think we'll see some of that later tonight, and most importantly, it requires resetting mentally, at least a few times during the game. When we talked about critical moments last week, if you get to a critical moment, that's a chance to take a moment and decide, am I really better? Am I justified in going for this sacrificial attack, or am I just giving away my pieces because I want to?
Yeah, and I think this is really important whether you are a beginner or a grandmaster, whether you're Andrew Hoy or Rufus Bear.
Yeah, or any of the other players in our
Right, yeah, or any of the other players.
All right, so let's jump into our first game, and that was the game between Alex and Chip. So Chip actually shared some of his thoughts with us on this game, so I think we'll bring some of those in too because they were very helpful. So Chip, thank you for sharing that with us. We started off with a relatively topical Caro-Kann defense. This is all very normal stuff so far. And here Chip played h6. So Chip said he wanted to give his bishop a square, and it was a little bit premature because he doesn't have to worry about knight h4 just yet, while the queen can still cover it. I think h6 is fine. I think more typical is something like knight e7 or even knight h6, but there's certainly nothing wrong with h6 in this position. And now this is kind of an interesting moment that I wanted to talk about. Alex took back with the queen, a perfectly fine move. One other alternative that's really interesting and a little bit surprising is to actually take back with the pawn. It looks crazy. We're doubling our pawns and it kind of is a messy pawn structure. But the point is that black's only pawn break is to play c5 sooner or later. And white's idea is that when black finally plays c5, we'll take, and then we'll move our d3 pawn up to d4. I
just thought this was really cool. You showed this to me just a few minutes ago, and I admit I'd never seen it. So backing up a moment and looking at something like the, I'm going to go back to our sort of generic chapter here, but looking at something like the advanced French, we know that white's typical idea in this position is to play c3 to defend with his pawn. And when white fails to do that, he often gets into trouble and loses control of the center. So this is just a fascinating way to kind of work around having messed up. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, and I don't even know that I'd call it messing up. Knight c3 is a totally viable line, and it gets very sharp. But since the knight is on c3, and we can't put our pawn on c3, black would complain about the legality of that move, we instead find a different way to kind of reinforce our center. So anyways, just a cool idea, something that you can file away and maybe use in some of your own games later.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. Continue.
So as we go, I think that Chip played very accurately, and here Alex makes a little bit of a positional concession, and I think his next three moves, he played b4, b5, and b6. It just seems a little bit artificial, and it doesn't really address the needs of the position. I think the more important things are castling and maybe pushing the f-pawn up the board if you want to attack on the king side, or if you're going to play for this b4 stuff, it's probably better to play knight a4, a3, c3, that type of stuff, and go a little bit slower. The strongest plan for black now would be to quickly bring a knight to c4, and it's actually really hard for white to fight against that. So knight b6 here would be a very strong move. Knight g6 was played. This is also a good move. It's a very common idea. We're going to try and develop the bishop and finish development this way. It does invite h4 and h5. Anytime you see a knight over on this g6 square, you kind of want to throw your h-pawn up the board at it. But again, as we see this b-pawn continue up the board. And finally, Alex just sacrifices the pawn. So I don't quite know what b6 was.
No, and I haven't had a chance to talk to Alex about this game, so I'm not really sure. It could be that he was just seeking piece activity on the b file, but I think we can see here after knight takes b6 that the rook is not actually so terribly active. That knight is pretty secure. I'm not necessarily sure he's getting enough to justify it, especially after the knight comes to this delicious c4 square.
Yes, and that it hops right in without further delay. So again, from here, I think Chip played extremely well. It was a very clean win. And I just want to show a couple more of these attacking ideas because some of them were really nice. It does look like white is getting some activity on the f-file. There are a few things that you have to worry about. Already, you have to start looking at moves like rook takes f7 and queen takes g6. In this case, because there aren't pieces on the king side, we can take back with the king and defend the knight that way. But again, it's these types of ideas that are attacking ideas, and you always want to look for when your structure gets compromised with a move like h6. Here, Chip correctly counterattacks in the center, and I think that c5 is the pawn break that you really have to be playing for in the Caro-Kann, and the French for that matter. Maybe he can take back with the pawn. I think taking back with the pawn to get a little extra center control might be a little bit more common and a little bit more normal.
It does give him an opportunity to play c4 and forking the rook and queen as well, which probably Alex won't allow, but it's not bad to ask the question.
And I think regardless, the double isolated pawns are very bad, and we'll watch Chip in the next three moves take very quick advantage of that. So already it looks like the only move is something like knight f1 to defend e3. After rook to f3, Chip correctly played knight e5, and he's winning a decisive amount of material.
Yeah, so well played by Chip, and I think some things to work on for Alex. The main one being that a little bit too much aggression out of the gate, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, giving up a whole pawn for activity under circumstances that are not something you read out of a book, right? Not a specific gambit idea. I think it's just too experimental.
Yeah, and I think some of it took too long. The 3 moves in the opening are really important, and we care more about the tempi than even the pawn.
Yeah, in fact, if you look at most gambit play, the entire idea is to gain tempi for the pawn. So to lose tempi and the pawn, I agree. It seems to defeat the whole purpose.
Yes.
Yeah, nicely said. So, continuing on, we had this matchup between Tyler and the increasingly appropriately nicknamed Killer Ted. This was an expected opening from Tyler. He opened with the Nimzo Larsen attack, which I know to be a favorite of his. And this was one of the games I was thinking of when I talked about this removing the guard idea. So I wanted to point this out because clearly the idea of this opening, and I know Tyler's very familiar with this, is to create this flank pressure on the center. And when you are lucky, you end up with, winning an entire rook on h8 or something like this kind of dramatically. We've noticed one of the main improvements that I've seen, if you want to just talk about one concrete detail between the Bachelor Memorial and this outing, has been that no one has given Tyler, much to his chagrin, that kind of a start, right? He has had to work much harder for his positions. But after bishop d7, as sensible a move as it is, Tyler does have an option here to be able to pick up a pawn. We could play bishop takes c6, which removes the knight, and just like we saw in the Ruy Lopez, the knight defends the e5 square. So after Ted takes back, presumably with the bishop, I think, I'm not sure that it matters, right? We would have the option, I'm pretty sure we want to keep that bishop on at all costs. So knight takes here, we're already accomplishing our goals, we're up a pawn, we're going to have to deal with a little bit of counterplay, but we've accomplished the main task that this opening sets out to do. So I think this is another thing I wanted to throw at Tyler to show him, right, another option for ways to chip at the center. Instead, we had this move c4, which was a good suggestion in a different position. Unfortunately, here it doesn't quite hit to the purpose. So we have another couple of moves. Ted eventually plays a6, which forces the removal. But now, because of the knight on c3, there's no chance at winning this e5 pawn. So in any case, Tyler plays this maneuver, right? He does manage to get a little bit of the center, but without winning any material. Things start to lose focus a little bit, but I don't think it does the position any major harm. We have a couple more moves, and the next critical moment here is right here. So I spoke to Tyler after his game, and I said, this is the kind of mistake I think you only make once as a chess player. This is, yes, a free pawn, but the fact that Ted has done such a solid job to finish his development and bring all of his pieces into play means that he has a certain amount of natural defense to this kind of move. Because after queen to g7, we can see that the g-file is now open for business for the black rooks. And although it is not yet completely fatal, Ted very nicely, I think, plays queen to e6 and takes away a potential escape square for the queen, which sets a subtle trap. Tyler, not understanding fully the danger as of yet, castles into it, and now rook d to g8, I think, just wins the entire queen. Yeah. Excuse me, I guess Tyler does find a way out of it, I should say, but it's still not enough to rescue the significant material loss and the fact that there is a massive attack coming.
Yeah, already I think queen takes h8 is the move that makes more sense than retreating the queen just because of the rooks. They're too strong. You have to do something about them.
Yeah, I think something like this is probably losing for white, but
it's definitely losing, but it's at least there are some practical chances.
Yeah,
left.
Right. I think so. Yeah, and not to mention, there's always a little value in shock value. Yes. Right? Taking your opponent out of what he was expecting. Although I think Ted may have been prepared for this. Now I think about it, I did get an email from him saying that he was expecting the queen sack for the two rooks. In any case, so Tyler does find a clever way to save his queen. My apologies, but it's not enough to deal with the massive pressure he's facing on his king, and we see that Ted is not going to let this opportunity pass him by. I know that he was a little frustrated with himself for letting Felix off the hook last week, and so here, with another winning position, he was not going to let it slip away. And we can see probably Tai should trade the queens off. He is unfortunately now down some material, but it would at least be a way to release the pressure a little bit. But I understand his desire to keep things complicated.
Yes.
Maybe there's a chance to play for a win. It makes sense. But unfortunately, there's just too much pressure. So bishop takes f3, demonstrating the power of this outrageous pin. Tai tries to get out of it, but unfortunately, this blocks the rook's defense of g2. And that was pretty much all she wrote. White resigned, but perfectly logically, because at the minimum, he is going to lose the a2 rook. There may even be a checkmate here coming. So, a nice game by Killer Ted. Congratulations to you. We'll see how you finish in round 6. And I think some opportunities for Tyler to see this opening is not dead for you. You've got still getting some of the ideas. They're just subtler than they used to be.
Yes, definitely. All right, let's move to the next game. This was between Bill and Dave. And we actually started off with an open Sicilian. So it was a kind of modern dragon where white castles short. And we get these positions that are really quite rich. White has several plans. Black has really just the one plan to develop the pieces in the center and play for d5. So I think we'll see pretty quickly on that we already have reached a critical moment. Right now, White has to decide what to do with the knight. And typically, White plays knight b3. It's more important to keep the knight on than to do anything else. Something like bishop e3, you don't really want to leave a piece on d4. This has been played, it looks like, 10 times before. And already we see that Black has some ideas. There are ideas of knight g4. There are ideas of e5. You can take and play queen b6. So it's already a rich position. I think the main line is bishop d7 here and wait on all of those things, but you can kind of see that there's a lot to be said for keeping the tension.
No, I'm just amused because I talked to Bill after his game and I had advised something like bishop e3. I recognized, of course, the pressure, but didn't think it was such a big deal, so I guess we all learned something, Bill.
Yes, yeah. So knight b3 is definitely the best move to play, and here I think we've had many, many games. It looks like only several hundred, so this is definitely the main line. And the idea is that White is now going to start attacking. White's going to play f4 and f5, or maybe e5, depending on the position. Usually king h1 comes at some point. h3 is often played to avoid knight g4 once the queen moves. And White will just slowly build up and start to put the pieces where they eye the king. Instead, Bill took on c6. And now this is kind of a changing of the pawn structure that does not favor White. We're making it much easier for Black to get in this d5 move. White has traded off a centralized knight for a less centralized knight. So already I would say that Black's at least equal and maybe a tiny bit better if he can get d5 in short order.
Right.
So we actually see just that happen. e6 is played, which is a little bit surprising because we are pinning ourselves. But White kind of lets Black off the hook by taking on f6. I really don't like this. I think it's more important to keep the dark square bishop on and have ideas of playing bishop h6 or even e5. Like e5 here is a perfectly valid move. And I think even if we're sacrificing a pawn temporarily, there are some really strong ideas here that would potentially be things that we have to worry about.
Yeah, keeping pieces on and trying to pressure the pinned piece as opposed to trading it.
Exactly, yes. So by trading it, I would say at this point Black is clearly better and probably close to winning due to the bishop pair and the fact that he just got this d5 push in. And we actually see that Black converts without too much more trouble. He continues to play well. He brings the rooks to the center. I like this d4 move. It opens up the bishop on the king. And we'll see that Black correctly goes for some attacking ideas. He pushes this pawn to d3. And even though it looks like the pawn might be getting loose, it's justified tactically because now bishop g5 attacks this this rook and it's pinned to the queen, so Black wins an exchange right away. One alternative would have been rook d1 to try and attack this, but already we see that Black has sufficient ideas with things like bishop e4 and bishop f5 if this is played, and he should be just fine to hold on to d3 long enough for other things to happen, like the white king to get weak.
Yeah, other good things, as we say.
Yes, exactly. So after the exchange goes, I think that is really the end of the game, but we do see a little bit more pressure, and I really liked this bishop f3 move. I think it's a really nice demonstration of just how weak the king is and how important this pinning idea is here. Already, I mentioned to John while we were getting ready, it would be really nice if we could play rook takes d3 defending the queen. Unfortunately, queen takes g2 would be mate, so that's not possible. So after f3, bishop takes f3 is just a nice tactical trick, and it gives us just enough to close out the game.
Yeah, this game really is a statement on the delicacy and the difficulty of this pinned e3 rook. But I also have to say, I love any tactic in which there are multiple pins going on simultaneously. Yes. It feels like one of those awful emergency situations in which you say, call the cops, and no one moves because you didn't point to them specifically, right? All of White's pieces are hanging around watching this happen, and nobody is doing anything about it. So well played to David, and yeah, I think some very easy corrections for Bill to make to put more pressure on his opponents the next time he's playing well.
I agree.
Yeah. Continuing on, and speaking of, I think, ways to keep up the opening pressure, we had this effort between Salal and Lydia. So we had a fairly standard beginning of an Italian game, and Lydia plays a little bit of an unusual sideline here with this h6 move. So the idea of this is pretty simple. She wants nothing to do with knight g5 and a lot of the attacks here. A more typical line in the two knights is to allow this kind of thing. You and I think, both feel that black is okay here, that there are perfectly good opportunities after something like d5 and knight a5 being a main move. But she decides, right, this is certainly a way you can play. I would have maybe preferred just to play something like bishop e7. I think we stop all the same maneuvers without running into the same tactical difficulties.
Yeah, I think both bishop e7 and h6 allow White to claim an advantage with c3 and d4. White is going to take the tempo that he's getting, or she is getting, depending on who's playing, and expand in the center and claim that d4 square.
Yeah, quite right. Yeah, I mean, I myself play knight f6 in this position every time. I think we have to learn a little bit more theory. But I know for a fact that Salal is fairly new to a lot of these attacking ideas, so I have a feeling that h6 probably was actually quite successful in this one game in terms of flummoxing him. But he makes a good principled move. He castles his king. After knight to f6, d3 would have been a little bit more accurate. We don't want to fall victim to the so-called center fork trick. Knight e4, knight takes, and here this instantly equalizes the game for black. Because black is able to get rid of White's center pawn, but equal is not by any means winning. So this is not a major harm, and Lydia also does not pick up on it. So bishop to c5 is certainly sensible. Now the center fork trick will no longer work because the knight will be able to pick up the bishop on c5. This move, though, I think is a little bit too quick. So I think probably the lesson for Salal here is very simple. When your opponent has reinforced a point, you have to change your count. You may have very well, and I suspect, be thinking about playing this move next turn, but that doesn't mean that you can do it heedless of what happened. And I think probably what happened here was Lydia just changed the arithmetic, and Salal did not adjust. So he hangs a pawn. He does respond nicely. I think the knight comes to a decent square, and now she overreaches. Rook e1 was actually not the most accurate move, fascinatingly enough. I think queen e2 is an even better way to take advantage of the pin, but I think for practical purposes, this is a good move. He's taking advantage of the open e-file. He's showing he understood something about losing the pawn, and he's got a great chance to win here. Unfortunately, it takes some tactical finesse. Lydia plays the most obvious reply, and the thematic one, not to take anything away, d5, but this is actually a game loser if Salal can play heads up. Bishop d5 here would have been an excellent move.
Doesn't that hang the bishop?
Why? I'm so glad you asked. The problem is that if queen takes d5, Salal would have the excellent knight to c7, picking up a whole queen. And probably the knight as well in just a minute, frankly. So this would probably have ended the game because, although Lydia is, of course, under no obligation to take, the problem is that the knight is also hanging. You can take on c6. There are an awful lot of good things happening for White here. So this is the big, I think, thematic idea for Salal to remember for next time, and it is, of course, another remove the guard. as much as it's also, yes, attraction and knight forks and all of these other wonderful things. There's a lot going on. So missing this was, I think, probably the big moment in the game. And although Solal does manage to sort of trade off some pieces and consolidate, now we see Lydia's active pieces in the center come home. And bishop takes f2, king f1. She picks up the exchange and a pawn and unseats the king. And then rook to e8. The position, unfortunately, collapsed very quickly. Solal did his best to try and activate his pieces, and I think should be applauded for it. But he just, I think, felt very uncomfortable. And Lydia found a lot of accurate moves to be able to trade away his attackers. And then, of course, the material advantage ultimately showed itself. So it was a nice, clean game for a finish, I think, but really, I think the main thing for Solal is focusing on cleaning up the opening.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's interesting that both players had chances right out of the gate, and it was a very nicely played game from Lydia, with the exception of that d5 trick that you mentioned.
Yeah, and that's something I've noticed from her. It's really a question if she is not going to make more than one significant mistake in the game. It's just, unfortunately, sometimes it's been enough and at the right time that it's cost her the whole thing. But she recovers very nicely, and I think is generally a good, consistent player.
Yeah, and that was a very good game, with that one exception. All right, let's take a look at the game between Danny and Rob. And this started out as a London system, but Rob was deciding to play something sharp right out of the opening, and already we can see that there are a lot of move order tricks going on. White could play something like d5, which would transpose into a Benoni type structure, either a Benoni, a Banco, a check Benoni, but something where d5 is played very early and then it's reinforced with c4. White could play e4. We would transpose to a Mora gambit. This could be a lot of fun. Or, of course, he could play bishop f4 like in the game and try and play a London system. I think here, the best move by far is to capture on d4. It kind of forces the queen out a little bit early, and we end up playing something that looks like a Scandinavian, but it's not quite a Scandinavian.
Yeah, I wonder if you could even, after c takes d, you could take on b8.
You can, and that is an idea. Unfortunately, I just hate giving up the bishop this early, and I think that here there are no problems whatsoever for black to solve. He has an extra bishop, and he's just going to develop normally and be fine.
Right, yeah, so perhaps the not getting your queen harassed is really just not worth giving up the whole bishop pair.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But we do transpose to a relatively normal-looking Benoni structure, and I think we'll see that the London system is something that you can play the same 6 moves no matter what your opponent plays and end up with a reasonable position. So now we've kind of transposed into one of the main lines of the London for white. I think a6 is a little bit unnecessary, but this fianchetto stuff is pretty typical in a London system as well. And I think it's a pretty well-respected way to play against the London as well. Now, we did see a few tricks. c4 was played. It looks like it's going to bring the queen, lure it to this e4 square. White plays the active in-between move of knight takes, and now white has to decide where to put the bishop. And putting it on e4 would actually be a big mistake because the bishop runs out of squares. So instead, Danny drops the bishop back to e2 and keeps everything under control. And now after d5, I think Rob could have played something like knight e5 and been perfectly happy, probably equal, maybe a tiny bit better because of the extra queenside space that he has. Unfortunately, he gave away the knight for some reason, and it looks like he's getting an active bishop, but it's really not enough, and a piece is a very significant material advantage. And Danny was able to convert very, very nicely from here with really no further effort. I think this e-pawn ran up the board. I might have played knight d4, bring the knight to a more active square. I never really have to worry about this exchange. I think that white will always be able to play f3 at an opportune moment and erode black's center. Instead, knight d2 is okay as well. And we see that Danny found this f3 idea correctly, and after he takes on e4, it's really hard for black to recapture on e4. If he takes back, something like this is really bad for black. White has an extra center pawn. The rooks are both active. This bishop on f6 is in trouble, so we almost have to take on e4, in which case white would have the bishop pair and the light squares. So it's a really bad position. I think h4 is a little bit of desperation. Danny correctly brought the bishop back, kept everything under control, and now we see that after this, g3 is played, and there's a little bit of life for black because he does get a few checks in, but it's not enough. The bishop defends very nicely. Queen takes e3 probably should have been played. This is just kind of a reflexive move. You have to do something when you're down this much, and then maybe even something like d4, hoping for bishop takes e4. But again, I just don't think it's anywhere near enough. I think that almost any move, certainly we would start by capturing and then bring the rook to a good square, and this would be absolutely perfect for white.
Yeah. Yeah, I have to say, I don't want to... I'll have to see how round 6 goes, but I am starting to notice that Danny has a pretty solid reputation as a good closer.
Yes.
He struggles, as we all do, when the position is bad for him or awkward or just unfamiliar. Mm-hmm. But when you get him into something that he's comfortable and has the better end of it, he seems to come away with the point. I haven't seen him drop a lot of games that he was winning.
Yeah, and that is actually one of the hallmarks of a very good player. You're able to put your opponents away and not let them back into the game when you do get those large advantages.
Yeah, I'm intrigued to see. And that would perhaps be also my warning to Rob that most players, I think now, after 2 tournaments and looking towards the winter, I don't think that anybody's going to let you get away with giving away a piece like that anymore.
I agree.
So it may simply have been a mouse slip, in which case we should stop and leave it alone. It happens. But I think it's worth remembering just on the off chance. But very good, well played by Danny. Carrying forward, another game that I thought was very commandingly played. So we had Chris... do we have multiple Chris's? No. Chris versus Dave.
We have 2 Chris's.
Ah, yes, I knew it. Thank you.
No problem.
All right, names are getting dropped here. We have Chris Host versus Dave Morrissey. We also have 2 Daves. And this game was interesting. So we had kind of a reverse in which the opening was played rather poorly by white, right? There's an opening inaccuracy. Dave offered the Scandinavian. Of course, the main move here is simply to take, and usually black will take back with the queen, and at minimum, I actually like knight f3 here, trying to play for a big center, but at minimum, white will get this knight to c3 move, pop the queen, gain a tempo, and have a comfortable game. Of course, black could also offer knight f6, but that's getting into the weeds of the Scandinavian. But Chris instead plays knight to c3, and David, I think, has had this position a number of times, and so he quite rightly has adjusted and plays d4, which is a nice move to immediately demonstrate the problem with white's play. This already creates a little bit of discomfort for the white pieces, and Dave follows it up with another nice move, which is e5, and suddenly, as I like to joke, Dave's playing white instead of you, Chris. He's got the whole center. Seems to have the momentum. What happened? The opening's already over. Unfortunately, as we so often see, once you reach a nice position, you can sometimes find that it's an unfamiliar one.
Right.
And I think Dave seemingly started to float almost immediately. We see some reasonable developing moves here coming up, but I don't like queen e7. I'm not sure that this check really is doing anything to begin with, so I don't think it should be pursued. I think sometimes Dave does get way too far ahead of himself trying to just relentlessly, constantly attack, and I think we've got to learn how to just put our pieces into play, get castled, and then go for the guy. You already have an opening advantage. I think perhaps he underestimated just how nice this already is for him. So we see something that I've started to see a lot from him, which is we develop very aggressively, but then don't always know what to do about our opponent's aggression. So this was a very nice move by Chris Host, not only declining to exchange, but taking the opportunity to shatter black's pawn structure. Bishop takes c6. Well, it happens, so we're going to see. I think right now you have got to do something about this. Either queen to d7, which looks a little optically dangerous to make the pin worse. So I think probably just bishop d7 here, making sure that this does not happen and that we maintain an eye over e5.
Yeah, even knight b8 would be a consideration because we can follow it up with c6 later. The most important thing is that because we are going to have opposite side castling, we have to keep that pawn structure intact. I think that giving any sort of open file or open diagonal around your king, especially when it's opposite side castling, is way too big of a handicap to play with.
Excellent point, Tyler. I see what you did there. So, continuing forward, a6 basically says, bring it on, which is not the attitude you want to have. This is very dangerous. And Chris says, thank you, I will. He takes on c6, then he takes on e5, noticing again, removing the guard. Well done, Chris. So knight to e5 is very dangerous, not only because of the loss of the pawn, but as we see, after c5, trying to hang on to the material, the real concern, Dave, is the square. Knight to c6 anyway, and we're going to be picking up even more material. Honestly, the rest of the coverage of this game is going to be pretty quick, because what follows almost shouldn't be shown to younger audiences. It was such a bludgeoning. And I just want to say that because... honestly, I know that I have been critical of some of Chris's games earlier in the tournament. He's a little new to this tournament, and I think is getting back into the game. This is a well-played game by him. He really took his opponent apart. He did not let him back in. And we see here that after a number of exchanges, Dave trying with a lot of... with sort of reckless abandon to get back into the game, only ends up hanging more material. And finally, after queen to g6, I think we can finish here. Knight e7 check. And... the queen is coming off the board. So well done, Chris, once again. And Dave had a nice start. Now let's learn how to keep it going.
Yes, yeah, very good. All right, so let's move to our next game. And we jump right in to the opening. So this is actually one of the more interesting openings that we'll see. I think that... Yes, Nick was in fact playing white here.
We're going to go move by move through this one, right? And at every moment compare it to the games of world champions?
Yes, precisely. Yeah. Yes. So that sounds excellent. Yeah. So this was actually the game between Nick and Andrew. Not me, Andrew, but the Andrew playing in our game.
Oh, and there are two Andrews?
There are, yeah. So I think that this opening is one of the more interesting ones. Black is defending with knight f6. He's defending his center. I think this is actually a little bit of a mistake already because white is going to have the opportunity to get a big center by playing e4. And now with the center pawn duo, black is going to have to find something very active to try and counterattack, either c5 or e5. And it's hard to play either one of those right away without hanging a pawn. So this is something that, Nick, you can file this away. When they play knight f6 on move 2, just take on d5.
Right, and if they take with the queen, of course, we get similar to a Scandinavian idea where we can, again, play knight to c3 and at minimum win a tempo.
Yeah, and this is even stronger than the normal Scandinavian because we can play bishop d2 right away, and we're immediately threatening discoveries.
Right, and we still have an e4 pawn. I'd much rather have the e pawn than the c pawn.
Yep, exactly. But the opening was certainly not the biggest issue in the game. Here, again, I think this is an opportunity to play b4. We can trap this bishop. This is a nice Noah's Ark trap, so named, because the joke is that this trap has been around as long as Noah. So b4, the bishop just runs out of squares, and white would win a whole piece. And we actually see that this is possible here as well. We can still play b4, and knight takes b4 isn't even possible because of the pin on the king.
Right.
So we would have to sacrifice the bishop, and in this case, even though our pawn structure gets a little bit compromised, it's an extra piece. It should be plenty to win.
Yeah, e3 there, and we're fine.
Yeah, or even knight e5. There are many good moves in these positions. So after a few more moves, we actually see that Nick has played very well. We get a normal-looking position. And here, this is kind of an interesting moment. Nick played e4, which makes a lot of sense optically. We're taking it over the center. We're getting a big center. I think it might have been more prudent to play e3. It's a very slow move. Since both sides have a light square bishop, it always makes a little bit of sense to put a pawn on a dark square. And more than that, we're reinforcing this d4 pawn. If we look at the position after e4, we'll notice that d4 is a little bit weak. It's on an open file, the rooks can come bother it, and it's a little bit hard to reinforce this pawn. So after e3, this pawn is very, very safe. It's never going to be attacked, and now white can think about developing slowly and normally. Moves like knight e5, b4, bishop d3 or c4, and I might castle long. I might even play king d2 and just bring the king up the board, noting, of course, that I can't do this until after I've played b4 and chased the knight away so that I'm not hanging any forks.
In case you're just joining the show, move order is important.
Yes.
Let's not hang an entire rook. Yeah, I also wanted to note when we were doing our pre-show discussion that to me, one of the other things that Nick can look for in this position is the fact that the queens and already at least one set of minors, or excuse me, two sets of minors have been exchanged. And that means that a space advantage is going to be worth at least a little bit less.
Yes.
It's not yet to the point that space isn't important, but the normal, obvious, let me grab all the space that I can, is maybe mitigated somewhat by the number of exchanges, especially the queens.
Yeah, and I've also found that looking at pawn weaknesses and weak squares, that becomes more important as pieces get traded off because it highlights what's left, and you can't really come up with active counterplay against that the same way that you would if the queens were still on and white could launch a kingside attack.
It's so funny because I tend to react to that by saying, oh, there must be fewer attackers then.
Yes.
But somehow it always ends up that the real weight falls on, no, there are fewer defenders.
Right, and it kind of goes both ways, so it's chess is hard. There's really nothing else that we can say about that one.
Well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you for joining our broadcast. Once again, okay, let's continue.
All right, so...
Rufus would have been happy.
He would have, yes. All right, so after rook d8, we already see just how difficult it is to defend the d4 square. And it's even worse because of this pin here. And white ends up hanging d4 to this nice little petite tactic, and knight b3 forks the rook and the pawn. So we see that even though black has gotten this pawn, white does have some vague threats. Maybe e5 could be played immediately, threatening bishop h7. But unfortunately, I'm sure that black would find something like rook d5 to defend that. All right, so after bishop c2, we have a few more moves. I don't really like taking on d4, but already white's position is very difficult. We would like to play something like f4 and try and open up other lines, but f4 is a little bit committal. It gives the g4 square forever. Black is going to move the c-pawn up the board, probably to c5, double rooks on the d-file. Black has a significant advantage already after e5.
Yeah.
Instead, after e5, by taking this passed pawn is already decisive, and I would say that white is going to have to find some heroic moves in order to not lose.
It's funny that you chose that exact word, as we'll see.
Yes, yeah. So in this game, after we get these two connected passed pawns, I think that it's pretty much all over. And black actually converted with some really nice technique, although after the bishops get traded off, it's perhaps even easier. And I think I probably would have put the rook behind one of the pawns, but rook b8 taking the open file and activating the rook is equally good. Black goes and picks up yet another pawn. We're now 2 pawns up in addition to 3 passed pawns, and there's really very little to be said about the rest of the game. There is one more move that we want to highlight because it's a very nice move, so we'll get to that position here after king to d6, threatening to push this pawn up the board. So I think this is a fine practical attempt. Black finds the very nice move rook d4, and after king c5 attacking the rook, instead of moving the rook, he presses forward with d2, which is making a queen no matter what white does in response.
Yeah.
And here, after the king captures, we even queen with check, and in very short order, white finds a way to lose the rook and ends up resigning here.
Yeah, but it's important to note, although rook takes a4 was a blunder, that there's in such a position, there is going to be a double attack.
Yes.
It is going to win the rook. It is simply a matter of time.
Yep.
So I don't think that is the point for Nick to focus on
No.
at all. But well played to Andrew L. I really was impressed by that. I thought it was well played by him, and it's nice to see him recover there. I think he had a tough week last week, if I recall correctly. Carrying forward, we had a game that was much more what we are frankly accustomed to seeing in this tournament, which is we had a lot of back and forth.
Yes.
This was Felix versus Frank, and we saw Frank open with an opening that I'm starting to see, I think he has developed an affection for, which is the Alyekin's defense. Felix does play the beginning perfectly normally, right? He gets a nice classical center, but he starts to kind of go for the throat a little too aggressively quickly thereafter. I don't think things are critical yet in the center. We do not have to trade yet. I think probably we could just develop our bishop as one example, or even consider playing c4. Those are probably both normal moves here. Taking is probably not a big deal, but I don't particularly like bishop b5. While this is quite obviously an attractive place for the bishop to be, honestly, it runs straight into tactical complications. Frank playing quite heads up. Nice work here. He plays queen a5 check. It looks like knight c3 saves the day and sort of holds everything, but now once again we have remove the guard. Knight takes c3, leaves a free bishop, and although Felix is able to trade everything away so that he doesn't lose a piece, he is losing a number of pawns in the position, and is now, after queen c4, another nice move by Frank, struggling to castle. I do think here that bishop to a6 would have been the best move. This prevents any queen e2 ideas to trade things off, as well as making sure that castling is happening approximately never. And this probably already would have been opportunity to maybe not end the game, but command it all the way through. So this would be the thing that Frank should look at for next time, I think, as an opportunity to make his good idea even better. Instead, he tries to play a classical principle, develop his pieces, I understand, right? But this does allow Felix a little bit more wiggle room, as of course with the queens off, now it's not as important that my king couldn't castle. We see a couple more moves. I do think that Frank is still in a very commanding position, and finds his way through some even further good play to this moment where e5 comes and we see a beautiful pawn center emerge. So things are still looking very good for the black pieces. Unfortunately, I also really like a5, right, trying to kick this knight away. So a lot of really good things are happening, but what I wanted to skip to was I did think it was a little bit unnecessary in this moment to play e4. We have this gorgeous pawn center. We are keeping the bishop out of any kind of active play. We have almost entirely killed the knight. Why are we giving up this square? I do not like this move. I don't care that it activates my bishop because it allows too many good moves that don't hang any material by white. So I don't like this. I want it to stop. Instead, I would suggest probably something as simple as just looking at this very quickly, but probably just bringing the rook to the open file and planning ourselves at some point. We can probably even look at doubling at some. I know there is some pressure here, but I think we can deal with that and probably ourselves push d4 to crash through, which is closer to what ends up happening. So I think this does let white back in the game a little bit, but Frank, not to be outdone, finds some more good moves, seizing the open file, and after this exchange of bishops, finds his way to pushing d4, and now we see that more lethal tactics are being threatened.
And if we go back one moment,
yes.
I think we actually had a trick here. I think in this very position, black has the very cute trick e3 check. Of course, we cannot take with the rook because that would hang the whole knight. And in this position, if we take back with the king, oh, wait, we can't. That's illegal.
Oh, yeah.
So the king would have to go backwards, and that would hang the knight to the pawn.
Well, we could do it over the board.
Yes, exactly. If your opponent's ever not paying attention, you have a lot of options that way.
We do not advocate cheating here at Acceptable Chess. But it is one of those funny things about over-the-board play. You do sometimes have to watch for these illegal moves. I have them happen by my opponents on a regular basis. It is not a problem on late chess, thankfully. So Frank's just completely winning here, and frankly, it, again, is a bit of a tragedy that he wasn't able to come away with this, but all I can say to Frank as consolation is, you played really well. This is definitely a well-played game by you, and the fact that it didn't quite work out should not make you feel too badly about the game. But let's look here. So he does manage to drive the rook away, another remove the guard. They're all over the place in this week, and picks up the knight. But somewhere in here, with a lot of lethal mates being threatened, he's just not able to find the finish. So d2 is very nice, and we are threatening to promote. But now here, you showed me this line a few minutes ago, and I loved it. We've got pawns ready to queen. We don't care about hanging pieces anymore. It's time to end the game. Pawn to e2, and if something like king f2 looks pretty obvious, right? We'd rather that than the bishop. Unfortunately, there are just too many pawns looking to make queenhood. Promotes to a queen, rook takes, promotes to a queen, and that is échec mat, as the French say. This would have been the end of things, and there's nothing Felix can do to avoid it. So that is probably the second moment to look at in addition to this bishop a6. Instead, I believe that I had talked to I talked to Felix after this game, and he had said that Frank had mouse slipped with this move, bishop b5, which is really unfortunate, and Frank, just to twist the knife a little, Felix had said that if you'd asked, he would have given you the move back. He just didn't know what was happening. So I think it's probably worth, give it the ask, right? It's the game on the line. Felix takes the rook, and unfortunately, Frank's game seemed to fall apart really quickly thereafter. He gives up the pawn, right? He gives up the rook, and all of a sudden, it's all in Felix's favor, and Felix does not let the chance slip away. So not to take too much away, of course, Felix is a scrappy player, and one of the reasons I give him credit is because he finds ways to win these games. He was in another tough position last week against Head, but I still think we got to give the most credit to the senior Jakes.
Yeah, I agree. And there's just one other moment that I want to point out in here because I think it was interesting. If we go back further, so right after this mouse slip of a move, I think that here, this is a moment that if we remain objective, Black can sit back and say, do I have to resign or can I come up with something tricky in order to keep playing? And here, if Black were able to find E2 yet again, Black would still be winning here. And even though we're hanging this rook, last time E1 queen was leading to mate in 2, now that would just hang everything, unfortunately, because there's no more rook to defend it. But instead, we can see that we can play D1 queen, and we would actually end up with a queen against a rook when all is said and done. Yes, white can capture the bishop with either pawn. Taking with the a pawn is probably a little bit more accurate, but Black is going to pick up the c4 pawn, attack both of these pawns, attack the rook, and Black should be winning this position even though he has made a huge mistake and lost all of his material. He can still come back and win if he sits there and buckles down and looks for another win.
Yeah, it's often the second mistake that kills you, and learning psychic toughness, I think, is very important and something that you'll get. So I hope Frank comes back. Well, of course he'll be back next week, but also for future events, because I know this was his first time playing in a long time, and I think that's one of the things you can practice.
Yes, I agree. Moving on, we had the game between Greg and Matt, and this actually started off with a Slav, and we saw some relatively modern theory in the semi-Slav. So here, after moves like knight d7 and bishop d6, Black has to decide how to finish development and how to get his queenside out. So in this particular case, Black correctly decided to take on c4 and play b5. Now after b5, bishop b7 is a very normal move, and Black's plan is simply to play c5. In order to play c5, we first need to make sure we're not going to hang the b5 pawn. So in this position, we'll let white castle. We'll frequently see moves like a6 or queen b6 in order to defend that b5 pawn. In this particular game, bishop e7 was played, a little bit passive. Perhaps Black can play for a little bit more. And now after b4, we see that this knight is very low on squares. Greg decided to bring it to the king side with knight e2. And here, after c5 was in fact played, we see one of the downsides to the Slav. So in this position, you'll notice that we have traded this d5 pawn for white's c pawn. That means that white has an extra center pawn, and that is enough for white to be able to launch some attacks. In this particular game, rook c1, a very normal first move, put some pressure on the c-file, on the queen. It's always a good idea to line up your rooks with the opponent's queen if you don't know what to do. And now after knight g5, we see that Greg very quickly plays the very nice move e5. This knight moves, and now Greg goes for it all with knight takes h7. This sacrifice is maybe a little bit unsound. I think with perfect play, Black is defending and holding on, but practically speaking, it's not bad. I think that white is getting a couple of pawns as compensation, and it should be enough to make it an interesting game.
I know that Greg is an actor and that he often takes part in experimental work, and I would say that this is another example of the kind of thing he's into. But yeah,
good, yes.
So this was an important moment for Matt, feeling some pressure, no doubt, but to buckle down and recognize he is up material, and if he can escape without getting checkmated, he's probably winning the game.
Yeah, anytime you have an extra piece, anytime your opponent's sacrificing a piece, defending is enough to win. You don't have to come up with your own good moves, you just have to stop your opponent's good moves. In this case, Greg continued very accurately with bishop c2, putting all the pressure on h7, and now after f5 we reach an interesting moment. In the game, Greg took en passant. I don't think this is the most accurate because it lets Black bring yet another piece to the defense. This knight is able to come back and hold the h7 square.
How are those arrows going for you?
Very, very poorly. Instead of taking en passant, although this bishop is now cut off, it might be even stronger to play knight g6. And the idea here is that if Black plays something like rook e8 to defend this bishop, Black has run out of squares, and here we see already that white has at least a perpetual by going back and forth and threatening all sorts of nasty discoveries.
Right. A perpetual with chances to play for more, which when you make an unsound sacrifice, that ain't bad.
Yes, exactly. And I guess we're getting a little bit deep and off the beaten path, but it's really nice when you're attacking to find that first perpetual. It's a bailout. You can now spend all of your time looking for a win, and if you don't find one, you can make a draw.
Nice tip.
It's like the escape routes. Always keep something in your back pocket to get out of dodge if you need it.
Right.
Anyways, in the game, Queen G6 is a very normal move. We're threatening some nastiness on H7 if we can make this knight move. So something like Knight H5 is a threat. Rook E6 is immediately threatened. So in order to deal with those threats, Black captured on F4. But that does allow another piece to come into the attack. This bishop is activating. And this knight on D5 was a very strong defender. So forcing that to be traded off is a little bit of an advantage for white. And now, for example, if bishop d5 is played in order to cover this e6 square, we have a cute line of bishop to e5, threatening to take. And if black plays something rote like rook f7, we have this line. We can take twice on f6, play queen h7 check, and sneak around to the back rank this way. Now, in this particular case, I think that black is okay, and I think he's holding on, so this is probably not quite enough. But I think that there might be something else with bishop e5, although I might be thinking of something else. Yeah, it looks like there's absolutely nothing for white, so this would be terrible. All right, so I think the moral of this story
That's why you come to this website, to see all of this incredible in-depth analysis. And
yeah, so the moral of this story is when I put bishop d5 in the analysis, it was because I thought this was a really good defensive move by black.
Yes, that's right. Exactly. That's what it was.
And this is why I should pay more attention when I'm annotating the games. All right, anyways, so in the game, queen c5 was played, and already we see that there's a lot of nastiness happening. Yes, the queen is a good defender. Maybe if we can get queen h5 in, we'll be okay. But we're hanging e6. Rook takes e6 is immediately a good idea. Something like queen h5 doesn't work because we can simply capture on e7. And in the game, instead, Greg played rook e5, which, again, I like that move a lot. We're lifting the rook with a tempo.
And cutting the queen off from being able to make it to the king side.
Yes. And the queen drops back, and now the rook simply comes to g5, renewing the attack. It looks like rook e6 might almost work because we have bishop e3. Unfortunately, there is this bishop d5 idea, and we don't have to take with the knight, which would hang the whole queen, but the queen can capture on d5, and we would emerge a rook to the good.
Yeah.
Instead, after rook e5, queen c6, rook g5, here we just had a blunder, and black missed that the pawn on g7 was hanging with mate.
I hate to do this, but Matt has hung mate and won in probably winning positions in 2 different games in this tournament. So, Matt, that's what you're working on.
Yes.
Simple as that.
Now, this is a very difficult position. I think already rook f7 is the only move that doesn't lose right away. Something like knight e8 looks normal because we're covering g7. Unfortunately, there's this really nice pattern with white's queen and bishop this way. The queen and bishop come up the board. And this is what I was trying to remember when I was looking at that other line that was total chaos. After king f6, we've drawn the king forward. And now we can play bishop e5, which looks like it hangs the rook, but we have this very nice pattern, and queen h5 is checkmate. The queen covers all of these squares, and the bishop covers the 2 squares that the queen does not cover.
Yeah, and you know, as much as that looks, I think, very difficult and complex, it's important to recognize that the sacrifice doesn't happen until you're looking at almost a mate in 2.
Yes.
So really, your job is to find all of these other nice attacking moves, and then maybe at the end a little bit of tactical calculation. So I think probably not beyond these players. Greg certainly knows his way around a tactic.
Yes.
But well done to him. He did a little bit, as I said, experimentally, but he came up with the point, and that's what counts.
Mm-hmm.
So, carrying forward, we had another nice attack that unfortunately fizzled out. So, sort of the opposite thing happening here. Chris White against Aaron. Chris opened with the London system. We're seeing quite a bit of this in the tournament, which does make sense because I know many of us are busy adults, and the London allows us some flexibility in being able to get a good position without having to study mountains of theory. Aaron brings his light squared bishop out early. We have an early exchange of the dark squared bishops. Aaron correctly takes with the queen. I feel like you and I had a conversation about this a little while ago, about the merits of taking with the pawn versus taking with the queen. And I know that sometimes it can be an idea here to take with the pawn, but I think you prefer Aaron's move here, yeah?
Yeah, and in this particular case, because white is not compelled to play c4, taking with the queen is much better. If instead we take with the pawn, sure, if white were to play c4, we'd be very happy with our decision and we'd be looking good. But white is almost certainly going to play c3 and then play for moves like e4 and e5 eventually. And in the meantime, this weak light square complex is something that's a bit of a drawback.
Yeah, so this, in other words, I guess another way for me to think of it would be, this is optically pretty to have the extra pawn to defend these squares, but because of these plans, you're probably not going to keep it.
Yeah, and the queen defends those squares almost as well. So I think it's perfectly acceptable to take with the queen instead of the pawn in this position.
Acceptable. Acceptable, you say. We'll continue. Okay, so some fairly typical developing moves by both players. Aaron, quite rightly, continues his aggressive style and plays c5. I think this is almost certainly correct. H3 is probably reasonable. I think probably this gives you an opportunity to win the bishop pair. And after Aaron quite rightly withdraws, Chris gains some space and decides to win it this way. I don't, I think, have too many objections here to most of these moves. I really wanted to carry forward and get to this moment. So after e5 and then castles, I think this is where things start to go really awry for the black player. Right in this moment, I think the most important move here is to take on d4. White is faced with some relatively unattractive options. If e takes d, the knight that has been sidelined on h5 is going to be able to come back into the game. This is very nice. We can, at minimum, trade it back for the light squared bishop and undo some of the damage that's been done. But maybe we can even hang out. There's obviously this very attractive d3 square if I can ever get there. But at minimum, it's enough to be able to get into the game, maybe pick up this g5 pawn. And of course, if c takes d, well, now there are more opportunities to open up lines against the king. Maybe c3 becomes a threat. I mean, I maybe can put this rook here right away and immediately start playing for these ideas. If the c3 b2 pawn moves, right, queen a3 check becomes an idea. There's a lot of attacking possibilities here. By instead closing the position off, we are going to see what happens. It gives Chris an anchor, which he is completely alert to and immediately makes use of. There's a little bit of a tactical line here. f3 does allow the knight back into the game, but I think Chris plays accurately. And after a few exchanges, we see now that there is a nice opportunity to regain momentum. Rook takes h3 is met with rook to f1. All of white's pieces are coming into the game. However, although there were some inaccuracies, things are not so bad. If Aaron castles here, just doing the sort of simple and principled thing, I think because of opportunities in the center, either the e4 square or if things continue, the d5 square, that black is going to continue to have play. Here, maybe something immediate like even just knight to b6 and try to occupy the square right away. I think that structurally, black, as you put it, is never getting checkmated and should have very good positional ideas here, and still a somewhat damaged but a queenside majority that he can make use of, as he did in our game. Instead, Aaron makes things far too interesting. This move b5 is met with e4 and the seemingly good move queen f4 check, threatening to win a piece here if, for example, white just scuttles away, is met with a very accurate knight to d2, saving the liability and counterattacking. This is a nice move. I was watching this game live, hoping that Chris would find it, and he did. And we see here now that things begin to very quickly unravel. Queen g5, suddenly the king is stuck in the center. Boy, I wish I'd castled earlier. King to f8, queen e4. All of white's pieces are streaming in. And now here, actually, instead of queen to f3, there is even, just to demonstrate the power of white's pieces, there's even queen to e6. Heedless of the pawn as it is pinned, threatening to pick up the knight, and a sample line might be knight to f6, queen e7 check, king to g8, followed by let's push our passer that we won with the tactic earlier. This is the one of two opportunities for Chris to put Aaron away that I want to show quickly. The other one is after f5, another idea with the d6 pawn is to play it immediately, play to pick up this rook. And I think white has a little bit less pressure here, but still after something like rook to d8, Queen b7, obviously, by the way, bringing it to the open file. This is just asking for it. We'll trade away that useful piece and come in with the queen, and there are massive threats here that are very difficult to deal with. So instead, rook to d8, queen b7, king g8, right? We're streaming in on the 7th rank, this pawn forming an outpost anchor, and things are not looking good at all. So this is a much better way to continue than what happened. Instead, in the attack, Chris makes the unwise decision to trade off attackers, I suspect that something was on the H file, but it never materializes. Aaron just saves his king, develops his pieces, uses this check as an opportunity, this move here, Queen H1, as an opportunity to centralize his king and go after the pawn. And although there were a couple of opportunities after this for some perpetuals and things like that, really what I want you all to learn from this game is just what happens when your attack fizzles, because all of a sudden we see there is a massive amount of pawn coming at you, and unless you are able to do something very accurately, very quickly, it's going to be all over. And instead, although Chris does get some checks in, Aaron's able to trade off the queens, and the rest is basically all she wrote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it just goes to show how keeping your head about you can give you the win, even if it looks scary in the middle game.
Yeah, very good. Yes, I should say, I placed the emphasis on Chris's missed opportunities there, but Aaron defended, as usual, quite well.
Yes, indeed. All right, so this is our second to last game, and this was between Charlie and Nate. Again, we started off with a Slav, and White played this very slow system with e3, and now this is kind of a Kali-type setup as much as a Slav-type setup. Once again, we see this early b5 and bishop b7. I think this is, again, a really nice way for Black to play, and it does force White to find some good moves. If White doesn't find all the right moves, we'll get to like this position after a6. Already here, I think that Black can play c5 and at least equalize. I think if c5 is played, there's very little that White would have, something like this. Yes, we have a discovery on the queen, but it's a one-move threat, and Black has at least equalized and is possibly even better because of this nice bishop.
Noticing a nice line here that I have to point out, actually, would be here it would look optically wonderful to play bishop b5 check, but there's an unfortunate problem that Black can simply go back with one of his knights and cover this. So although it picks up a pawn, I still think that Black is okay, and of course his pieces are still probably the more active.
Yes, indeed. And we can even take with the bishop if we don't want to allow that stuff.
Yeah, a little safer.
Yes. All right. So after not playing c5, I think this might be an opportunity for White to finish development. And after bishop d6, we see that White did in fact play e4, a very strong move threatening e5, which compels Black to play e5 himself. And after e5, it's a little bit hard for Black to make progress on this long diagonal. Here, White possibly could have improved. I don't love bishop e3. I think it allows Black too many ideas here. Black decided to castle first, and now Black played c5 to go with d5. Instead, I think taking on d4 would have been more accurate. Now you can play c5. It just prevents a few of these ideas that we see in the game.
Yeah, most particularly also just doesn't allow White to close the center down with something like d5. And of course now c5 comes with a tempo.
Yes, definitely. So here, just like you said, White did kind of shut the center down. He took several times on e5, and now h3 was played. I don't know if I prefer h3 or g3. I think there are drawbacks to both, but one of them has to be played. The advantage of g3 is that we can quickly play for f4 as well and start to expand. The big glaring downside is that there are some weak light squares.
Right.
All right, so now after c4, bishop b1 was played. Bishop b1 makes a lot of sense. Bishops are long-range pieces. There's no real downside to the bishop being all the way back on b1. After a few more developing moves, f3 was played. So this is the downside of not playing g3, where kind of less able to push the pawn up the board further. But now knight h5 is a little bit of a passive move. It brings the knight out of the center. Already we see that there are ideas of f4 attacking this knight, and to start to line those up, White played knight d5. And now, because of this f4 threat, Black is compelled to capture on d5. We recapture. Bishop h2 is played just to get the bishop out of the way. And here I think king h1 would have been stronger. There's no real threat. In this particular case, I think we do probably have to worry about knight g3.
Yeah.
But I don't know. It's a tough position already for white.
Yeah, it's interesting. This knight is actually managing through some activity to take advantage, even though he's awkwardly placed and, of course, about to be taken at any moment. So I think something could be on here, and probably it was up to black in this moment to try as much as possible. Maybe we can even play knight to g3 right in this moment, just to try and get as many pieces onto those dark squares and avoid trades.
Yeah, I think the move that was played in the game, knight f4, seems pretty good. We're threatening everything. After we capture with the bishop, I already like black a lot. I think the dark squares are a pretty significant advantage. I would even consider capturing with the queen. I think there are some nice mating patterns that you can start to see. Queen h4 is a big threat already. And white has some problems to solve, no two ways about it.
Yeah.
After bishop takes f4, rook d1, rook e7, we see that there is a little bit of a weak back rank for black, so that is something that has to be dealt with. And I think here bishop g3 is a little bit optimistic. I would have liked to see something like g5 even, cementing this bishop, solving the back rank problems, and only then going for some of these tricks with bishop g3. Yeah, we're threatening a mate, but white's really not going to hang anything, and the queen's already defending that, so it's not such a threat. And again, I think something like g5, as crazy as it looks, we are setting up for things like h5 and g4 to open up the position, and most importantly, we'll be able to play king g7 at some moment and not hang a mate. All right, so after bishop g3, queen d2 is played. We're seeing that there are some vague ideas of bringing a piece to g5. In this position, white brought the rook back, not wanting to have to deal with these back rank tricks. I don't think the back rank is such a threat just yet, because we do have this move rook e8 to meet the check. Of course, taking would be a little bit of a mistake because now we are losing.
Just a tiny bit, yeah.
So we do have to be a little bit careful. But rook e8 is fine as well. Now queen d4 was played, and queen d4 is a very committal move. I think it's very hard for both sides to win after the queens come off because of the opposite bishops. Of course, there can still be mistakes, but in this case, I would say that black is really the only one with winning chances because of the advanced structure, and even those, I think, are very, very limited because it's opposite bishops, and there's really no good way to create a passed pawn and attack at the same time. Here, I don't like g6. I think f6 would have been stronger, cementing this bishop. We cannot play f4. That would hang a pawn. And black will, in short order, play moves like g5, h5, and h4 to really permanently cripple this white kingside majority. And then black can start playing on the queen side. I'm not quite sure what I want to do on the queen side just yet, but there's no reason to decide. I can always make these moves on the king side and defend first and then move forward. All right, so we see a couple more moves. c3 is a little bit premature. It trades off, probably not in the best way. I think we needed to create a passed pawn, not trade off a pair of pawns. So it would have been better to play b4 first and only then c3 so that we do get this passed pawn.
I also really don't like the way that it gives, as we'll see in the game, a means of egress for that light squared bishop.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we see that very quickly. Already bishop b3 is an idea. And the way the game actually worked out, we actually see this bishop come to a2 of all squares. So because we don't capture here, and taking on b3 would have been excellent, this would let black have all of the winning chances in the position because he's the only one with a passed pawn. It's very far up the board. We're not actually hanging anything yet. There are no attacks that we have to worry about just quite yet.
Right.
But after a3, now all of a sudden white has a passed pawn as well, and white is up a pawn. And this bishop on a2, we'll see that even though it's a little bit passive right now, it very quickly becomes active.
These bishops blockading on the light squares. Where have I seen that before?
Couple of games, yeah. All right, and now after b4, this is a little bit of a tricky move, but we see that there are some really serious threats on f7, and unfortunately, black just missed the idea. And now after king to g8, I think that the most accurate would have been to double, but this discovered check is also very, very strong. White gives himself a square on e4, so he's not going to have to run into threats as the rook comes up the board. And now white struggles a little bit, but black makes his job much easier. I don't like bishop d5. I think there are probably slightly more accurate moves like bishop e6 that don't block our own rook, and we would have some mates already that are threatened. But bishop d5, we do see that we have the opportunity to take the bishop off and be completely winning here.
Right.
We actually didn't take the bishop until next move, but the bishop was not defended, so white was able to go on and win a very clean game from here.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, so incredibly well played, I thought, out of the opening by Nate, but interesting now to see how he adjusts to learning that middle game. And of course, Charlie continues to live up to his reputation. You know, he does not always play with the sharpest theory, but he knows how to play the game.
Yeah, and again, I think this is another example of some of those attacking ideas in the pawn structure. By playing f3 and g3, we did see that black had some good play in the middle game and would have had a few chances to win the game if he had played a little bit more aggressively with the knight and bishop on the dark squares.
Yeah, very good. So, moving into our feature and final match. Actually, we have a game which might receive a little bit quicker coverage, only because I think a lot of it was resolved a little more quickly out of the opening. So we had our big matchup this week between our two undefeated players, and something had to give. This is Rufus with the white pieces against Alex with the black pieces. Rufus opened with an opening that I know is one for which he has affection, the Evans Gambit. So Andrew, you're a practitioner of this.
I am. I like this a lot. I think that while there are ways for black to equalize pretty easily, it does pose a lot of problems, and I think that Rufus showed us a very nice way to play it. Here, I personally play queen b3. I think we're taking advantage of the fact that the knight can't come to a5 because there's a bishop there. d4 is also a theoretical move. Taking is perfectly normal. White sacrifices yet another pawn, but here capturing this would be a large mistake as we see that there's way too much pressure on f7. So black does not capture. Instead, he plays d6, and d6, I also think d6 is a mistake. Instead of d6, black really must develop. So either knight e7, knight f6, queen e7, or queen f6. Those are the moves that really must be played in this position. After d6, we'll see that there are a few ideas. I like capturing with the knight. I think capturing with the pawn would also be good. We see that one of the main ideas for white is actually to play e5 and open up another file. By playing e5, we see that we can actually do something like this, and it's extremely difficult for black to defend this now. Queen e7 runs right into bishop a3, and the queen really doesn't have any good squares. Queen f6, we're never castling. And already we can start to chip away at these pawns. I think generally we want to play something like queen b3 first, but already it's just a very, very nice position for white.
Yeah.
So instead of e5, knight d4 was played. Again, I think this is something perfectly fine. I think white's doing well and has an edge, even though he's down a pawn.
Yeah, so this was very nice, I think, for white out of the opening, and things get a little bit scrambled.
Yeah, I don't like taking on c6. I think we're trading off an attacking piece for a piece that wasn't doing so much. If anything, I would play e5 immediately after taking on c6 and really try to open things up that way, even at the cost of another pawn. I would also be fine with playing something like bishop a3 or queen b3 here. Again, just trying to complicate the position a little bit and open up lines since we are ahead in development.
Yeah, I like developing as well. I think that we are certainly not afraid of this capture, as it helps us with our center problems. So I agree. I think something like bishop a3 makes a lot of sense there. Is it insane to even think about f4?
Yeah, a little bit. I think the main line here, if I don't click the back button, is something like queen b3. And if black passes, we're actually threatening things like bishop g5 already, because we can take on f7, and if the king goes to a safe square, we can actually win the knight on g8.
Right, important that we get that piece back.
Yes.
Yeah, very good. So, continuing forward, we had instead, as we were saying, this knight to c6 move. Alex, trying to mix things up and play chaotically, takes on c3. And now after this exchange, we notice that black has his own share of aggression. There are a lot of loose pieces, but Rufus is still up a piece, so I think we have to say that the emphasis lies with him. Here, probably the easiest way to throw cold water on Alex's attempts to mix it up is just to play something cool, calm, and collected like queen to b3. Suddenly, again, kind of like our earlier discussions about maintaining objectivity, we don't have to be the attacking player. We can simply go up a piece. I don't think that taking the rook here is going to be a great idea because it's going to be met at minimum by bishop b2. Now, yes, he can trade the queen off for some amount of material, but I think the amount of development we have, the amount of attack we have, plus having the queen when you don't, that's got to be enough. I think Rufus knows how to win there. Instead...
And just to point out one more move, I think the cleanest win is actually queen d4, which defends the rook with an x-ray defense, and furthermore, it gets this knight from c6 out of dodge. After black captures on d4, white would recapture, and white, if we count the pieces, is not up material because there are so many pawns for black, but the activity of these pieces is paramount, and white would be winning quite easily.
And the bishop pair as well.
Yes.
Yeah, very good there. So instead, we went for bishop takes f7, king takes queen h5. So this does allow Rufus to get back in the driver's seat, knight d8, throwing in this check as well to get the knight temporarily out of hock. King to e8, queen to b5 check. But now we see he's more or less compelled to trade the queens. There are some opportunities here with queen to b7. They get a little bit chaotic, and it's easy to see why Rufus went for this instead. So after queen to b2 and trades, we see that we are going to pick up an exchange, and that is exactly what happens. Rufus takes the rook on h8, and things finally, after a lot of chaos, settle down with the white player in command. He has an exchange, and should be able to take advantage of the placement of this king to be able to make up for the sheer amount of pawns that black has on the queen side. But this is where I think the accuracy starts to degrade. Instead of this move e5, we both thought that f4 would be much more consistent. Probably also just putting a rook on an open file, attacking the weakness, makes a lot of sense. But with this plan of e5, it's more consistent to play something like f4 first, as of course now...
Yeah, I don't want to play e5 ever. I think, if anything, I'd like to play f5 and open up more lines against the king. e5 actually cuts off my bishop, and I might want my bishop to come back to d4 where it's a very active piece. So that's why I had such a visceral reaction to e5 when we saw it live.
No, you're quite right. I think I just realized as you objected that I was making a typical mistake, which is assuming that black was going to take and allow me to take back with the f-pawn and open this file. But of course that is the idea. So very much to the point. So this e5 move, I think, does not address the central concern, which is to get pressure on the king, just like the rest of the Evans is about, right? Yes. We haven't changed openings. So we see here that instead the pawn gets exchanged, and eventually, here we go, the bishop also gets exchanged.
Yeah, if we go back a couple of moves, I think there was an opportunity to play bishop e3, which makes a lot more sense. It centralizes our minor piece. We're going to finish our development normally, and black is going to have a little bit of a hard time advancing these pawns when they're on light squares. The key point is that after bishop e3, black would have to find b6, and now after rook c1, c5, and already we can see that there's a d-file that we can use. We can start pushing our a-pawn up the board to try and undermine this structure. And at some moment, we'll be able to play f3 and kick this knight out of the way in order to potentially trade off a pair of rooks. Anytime you see an endgame, and this is more of an advanced concept, where you have two rooks against one, you want to trade off one pair of rooks. And that's because you want to have the unique long-range movement of a rook for yourself when your opponent doesn't have that.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Very much a good endgame principle to remember. So I just want to note there that Rufus did say that he had planned on queen b2 when he played the line, so that's some impressive calculation there, and obviously leading to a winning position. So I think full credit to him. But moving on, now that I've praised him, I have to take it away again. We both agree we do not like this move, f takes. I think there's plenty of time. I think that there is no reason to be in such a rush to activate the king that you hurt your structure. It's almost always better to have one less h-pawn, and I'm not afraid of the passer possibilities here. I want to create my own passer, and best defend by attacking.
More importantly, simply, White must create a pass pawn. If White does not have the opportunity to make a pass pawn, he cannot win the game anymore. So by taking with the F pawn, I would go so far as to say that White no longer has winning chances. Sure, Black could still blunder horrifically and give up the game, but so first of all, I don't like giving up the bishop for the knight. And second of all, after taking with the F pawn, I don't see any practical way to a win for White anymore. So for those reasons, you must take with the H pawn, and I might even include Rook takes E8 first. We don't have to worry about anything like Knight E2. The Rook would come back, so Black must recapture. And now after H takes, we see that we have a much easier game to win. We're going to play F4, we're going to create that pass pawn right away, and then we can start to chip away at Black's structure. And in fact, we have even more of Black's pawns on open files that we can go snipe at.
Very, very good. And I think probably some of the best feedback Rufus is going to get about this game, because I know, and I want to mention this because of the benefit of our theme of objectivity, that he had mentioned that once he felt he could no longer win, he did get a bit tilted. And I think that is less because of any lack of respect for Alex, for whom I know he took very seriously in his preparation besides, but more because he, to quote him, hates draws. So I think he just had no interest in that result, and I think found himself getting frustrated, and it helps to explain what follows, which I think we'll handle fairly quickly, especially given the hour. So moving on from this position, the rooks are traded, and after some typical endgame maneuvering and an exchange of a couple of pawns, we find that White is doing reasonably well. Of course, he's still up the exchange, but there are some problems. It's difficult to simplify the position enough, and again, we see the inability to create a pass pawn over here makes it hard to find any win condition.
Although I do think that Black has made a few mistakes in the moves that you just went through very quickly, because the White king can now march unimpeded up the board, and this rook does a fantastic job of stopping this pawn from queening while also cutting off the Black king. So a simple plan would be to advance the White king to the 4th rank, check on a6, force the king back further, and then do it all over again. Bring the king up yet further and keep on pushing everything back collectively and try and win that way.
Right.
It's going to take some zugzwang tricks. We're going to have to play with the move order. We're going to have to attack the loose bishop, but sooner or later we should be able to get our king into the position.
Yes, and just to respond concretely, I noted that the bishop, of course, is defending against this a6 check, but since we're bringing the king to the center first, you're going to notice very painfully as the Black player that you cannot both guard the pawn and keep this threat live. So that would sort of end that problem before it began, and rook a6 should be very playable.
Exactly.
Very good. So instead we see, although Rufus begins this plan, quite rightly, that he does not take the opportunity here to centralize his king and perform the action that you just described. Instead, I think he felt that going after this potential losing pawn promotion was more important, and he finds his king on a relatively passive square. After rook to f5, this is maybe runner-up for our top prize of the week, but Alex finds a very nice remove the guard tactic once again. Bishop h5. I call this the U.S. Amateur Team East tactic because if you'll recall, I had, I think, not one, not two, but I actually think 3 games in which I allowed a tactic like this, so I will never forget it and never miss this pattern again. But here, it is important to note, Rufus still had good chances to steal the game. Rook takes g5 here would have been a really nice move where the obvious recapture of the rook leads to a very difficult pawn. The problem here isn't that the pawn is uncatchable, right? After something like king to f5, we cannot simply run the pawn up the board. But what we can do is we can play g4 check and dare him to take, because then we would run unimpeded, and White has the very easy task of simply taking here, walking at his leisure over to this part of the board, collecting the g5 pawn. And you have to know this endgame a little. It requires usually giving up the h-pawn at some key moment to win the opposition, but it's yours to win. So this was the last shot, but perhaps because of his disappointment, Rufus did not see that opportunity, took the a-pawn instead, and now here the best he can hope for is a draw. Unfortunately, the worst he can hope for is a loss, and that's just what happens.
So it's funny because when we were looking at this game, I said I would maybe try a little bit with White and hope that Black overpresses and like somehow gets his king stuck on h1 or h2, and you can play for some mating ideas. But again, I have very little objectivity. I also hate draws. I want to play for the win no matter how bad my position is. But at least I am going to sit here and think, like, how can I possibly lose? And only then, when you've figured out every possible way that you can throw the game away, then you can think about how you can help your opponent throw the game away first.
Right. And it's also important to note here that it's a hard position for Rufus to press in because he's down on time.
Yes.
And way down. I mean, he's got 50% of his opponent's time, and it's only 3 minutes. So however you want to measure it, it's probably not enough to do the kind of process you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the real trick here is that we need to activate our king as quickly as possible. And Rufus tries to do that. He does bring the king over very, very quickly. I like king e3. And now in this position, I think it's already a critical position. Here, I think Rufus just didn't see his opponent's threat, and he was still trying to win a little bit too hard. Of course, White can immediately make a draw by capturing the pawn, and he would have been disappointed with a draw, but I think leading the tournament by a point going into the last rounds, Rufus and Alex both would have had 4.5, and they would have been in the driver's seat to close out the tournament. If you do that, you at least are playing for first place next week. Unfortunately, now by not making the draw, by losing objectivity, Rufus is going to be hoping for a miracle to catch back up and share first place.
Right. He has to win and pray that Alex loses.
Yes.
So instead, we had, after king to e4, Alex play our move of the week, is this wonderful interruption tactic of bishop h3. It's not a blockade, but it does do a great job of blocking and preventing the rook from interposing at all or interfering with the promotion to h1. Although the rook does give this check, we see it's to no avail. King f2, and even if Rufus wants to check again, the king will eventually hide out on e2, and there is nothing to be done.
Yeah, now it is a little bit more subtle than you might at first think, because if we play this rook f6 move, we could see something like this where we're threatening a couple of checks. So for example, if we queen and make a rook, we can actually see that White would still have a chance to pick off that queen. Unfortunately here, we would be queening with check. So the black queen would get out of dodge just in the nick of time by getting that extra tempo.
I also was noticing that actually bishop f5 would have been an idea as well, throwing that in to throw the king off, just so we can gain one of these squares and not have to give up the massive skewer.
But I really don't want to have to figure out how to win with a queen against a rook. That's actually a little bit hard.
Yeah, especially with only a couple of minutes. Yeah, so that's not so good. So this was a surprising result. I think before the tournament, we did pick Rufus as our heavy favorite. And, I just want to take one moment here before we wrap up the show to say Rufus is clearly a very strong player. Rufus is going to win one of these tournaments if he continues to participate. I kid because I know he can take it. And congratulations to Alex. I mean, it was definitely white knuckle. It's hard to do this. He's still got one more game to play, and Felix is not going to let him off easy. But he's played really well. He found a way to win this game, and congratulations to him so far.
Yes, definitely. And you actually mentioned that Alex will be playing Felix. We do have our pairings for the last round. We can take a look at those right now.
Giving it away.
I am. Yeah, so you'll now see your pairings for the last round on the screen, and we will desperately be watching Alex versus Felix, and I'm sure there are a lot of people hoping for Felix to steal a win there so that Charlie or Rufus could catch back up to first place.
Yeah, and we are taking open bets on this game. No, I kid. We're not doing anything of the kind. One final note, though, before we wrap this up and go watch another game in which we are interested. We're doing something a little bit differently next week. Because the holidays are approaching, we have some travel plans that encroached on our normal show schedule. So this is what's going to happen. Next Sunday, which would normally be the celebration of the end of the tournament and the end of round 6, we will not have a show. There may be some possibility of some other streamed event that night. I'll see what I can do, but there will definitely not be a Roundup. Instead, the following Sunday, and I want to take a moment here to check my dates, that would be on Sunday the 29th at 7 p.m., we are going to do a double-length extra feature roundup closing out the entire tournament. We've got a couple of different ideas for extra things to do to cover. We're going to look at the champion of the tournament, whomever that may prove to be, in a retrospective and possibly an interview if we can get it lined up, and all sorts of other good stuff. So it will be a great episode. We're really looking forward to it. We wanted to do something special, and it'll be right after the holidays, so hopefully if you're not too anxious about work the next day, you can tune in and we can celebrate the end of this wonderful competition. But again, no show next Sunday evening. Don't come here. We won't be here. But other than that, thank you all so much for continuing to watch. Thank you so much for bringing your best each and every week and trying to improve and working with us. And for National Master Andrew Hoy, I am your host, John Harden. Thank you once again for watching Acceptable Chess.